his mother was depressed. You could feel her mood spreading through the house like a foul mist. Her face looked ravaged, as if she were about to collapse or die. Her unhappiness overshadowed everything, crushing you. He ate breakfast alone with his father in the dinette. They sat across from each other next to the window, looking out at the garden. Later, he'd have to go into her bedroom to kiss her goodbye. She lay under the covers with only her head showing. Her face was oily from a cream she'd applied the night before. She'd play the piano for hours during the afternoons, and he'd seek refuge in his bedroom behind a barricade of progressively closed doors, turning the lock of his own as if that would further stifle the sound. And still the music would seep through. Etudes, waltzes, sonatas. Then a sudden hush would descend over the house, and he'd hear the sound of the floorboards groaning distantly under her feet. Looking back now, he thinks of those years at home like a dimly remembered nightmare. Fragments of memories, of her telling him how unhappy she was, how his father was weak and didn't satisfy her, and how her whole life wasn't any good anymore, and she didn't know what to do, and she was bored, and maybe she would go out and get a job somewhere, even though she hardly needed the money, in order to give her life some kind of structure, some meaning. But he knew she wouldn't do anything. They went to temple during the high holidays. The men wore skullcaps and prayer shawls. The rabbi droned on in Hebrew, and the cantors sang plaintively. He liked sitting on the cushioned benches with a Hebrew Bible, watching the service and thinking about his life. Sometimes when he left the temple, he'd forget to take off his skullcap. Hours later, walking outside, he'd catch his reflection in a store window, grab it from his head and stuff it into his pocket, and he'd flush with shame. Everybody had seen him. He didn't want people to know he was Jewish. The Jews had killed Christ. Christ had been nailed to the cross. He'd seen paintings of Christ, blood streaming from his wounds. He imagined Christians looking up at statues of Christ behind altars, at crosses on church steeples, at rows of crosses in church cemeteries, fingering the crucifixes that hung from their necks, and thinking angrily of what the Jews had done to their God. If it weren't for the Jews, Christ would never have been crucified. He was painfully aware of his people's history, of centuries of persecution, exile, massacres leading to a systematic attempt on a grand scale to exterminate his entire race, as if it were an infestation of vermin. He'd seen pictures of Jews herded onto cattle cars bound for the camps, of emaciated corpses being dumped by derricks into lime pits, of huge piles of shoes, jackets, eyeglasses, briefcases, umbrellas, and jewelry, everything to be redistributed to the German people. Nothing was to be wasted, not even the bodies themselves, which were treated like butchered animals, the hair to be used to stuff cushions and pillows, the skin for lampshades, the flesh for soap, the gold fillings to be melted down for the national treasury. He'd imagine riding to a death camp in a crowded, stinking boxcar, trying to figure out how to escape, prying floorboards loose and slipping away under the cover of night in a freight yard in Eastern Europe, then traveling through a homicidally hostile country to freedom. Or if he didn't manage to escape, kneeling in a shower room surrounded by naked, thrashing children and adults, holding his breath to keep from inhaling the poison gas that hissed from the shower heads, clinging desperately, hopelessly, to a few more moments of life, while Nazi officers peered in through small observation windows. You couldn't help wondering how such experiences, spread over centuries, had affected the Jews. No wonder so many of his people in the post-war period straightened their hair, had their noses fixed, anglicized their names, married outside their race, and drove around in expensive German automobiles. It was a form of protective coloration, of blending into the surrounding countryside to ensure survival, of adopting the ways and manners of their enemies. When he first came to Washington, he wanted his own apartment, but he couldn't afford it. So he rented a room in a boarding house. there was another young man living on his floor, Ali, an Algerian who was finishing his law degree at Georgetown. On the floor above lived Zanib, a Berber woman who wore a robe and a veil, and Naim, also a student, who was from Yemen and was one of the most beautiful women he'd ever seen. She looked like an Arabian princess. Ali was her lover. She was very warm and friendly, and every time he spoke to her, he felt ugly and poisoned because he was a totally antisocial recluse. Not really a pleasant person, he thought. His grandmother sent him Russian tea biscuits, which he hoarded for himself, and sometimes he made elaborate meat and vegetable soups and would not share them. And he rarely spoke to anyone. He was just waiting to get enough money to move out into his own apartment. Then, one day, Ali came rushing down to his door and cried, "I think Naim is dying." He told Ali to call an ambulance. A few minutes later, 3 block-long fire trucks pulled up to the building, and firemen banged on the door. Apparently, they hadn't understood Ali's broken English. He told Ali, "I am not answering that door." The firemen, carrying axes, went upstairs to Naim, and he followed and watched them revive her. She was on the floor, unconscious, in her bathrobe. She was sweating. It turned out she'd fainted. The next day she came down to his apartment to speak to him. She said he'd let Ali flounder instead of taking control. "You know he doesn't speak English well. You should have made the call for him. He seems to think you were gloating over the whole thing." "I wasn't," he said. "Well, I don't understand why you couldn't be more helpful." Then she turned and walked up the stairs, and he slammed his door. Things were not going well for him. He was working on Capitol Hill with a group called Film Presentations. The company produced films for corporations that manufactured weapons for the Pentagon. He was working on a piece promoting a new drone bomber, a little plane that was supposed to sneak behind enemy lines on bombing missions. But the system didn't work. The planes were simply failing to accurately hone in on their targets. Of course, he couldn't put this into the script. His boss was a troubled older man. He kept a bottle of vodka hidden in his desk drawer, and would sometimes spiral off into fits of rage. In order to save money, he'd hired a tall, bearded animator who looked like Moses and had just come out of a halfway home. Years ago, he'd lost his mind and murdered his wife. He was still unstable, and he left midway through the project. He and Naim didn't speak to each other for weeks after the incident with the fire trucks. Then he got an invitation to come to a recital of Yemeni folk dances performed at the Washington Hilton. Naim had invited everyone in the household. He showed up, stayed a little while, and left. Later, when she asked, "Did you come to the dance?" he said, "Well, to tell you the truth, I did, but I only stayed for about 10 minutes. And she was furious. She was passionately tied to her culture and felt insulted. She called him a selfish bastard. He felt bad about it and decided to try and make it up to her. So one day when he ran into her in the hall, he asked, "Listen, do you play tennis?" She said she did. He said, "Well then, let's play." It was midsummer, and on the weekend they went to the public courts nearby. He had not played tennis in years, and he wanted to beat her. She didn't seem to take the game as seriously as he did. For her, it was just fun to be outside getting exercise. They had a drink afterwards at a cafe nearby, and she told him about herself. When she'd completed her undergraduate degree in communications at the University of Missouri, she'd been hired by the Arab League to serve as the liaison responsible for translating Sesame Street into Arabic format. She'd been excited about the project because Sesame Street tries to be non-sexist. But the Kuwaitis who were in charge of the project didn't want any girls in the television program, so she'd resigned. And that's why she'd come back to the States. Now she was working toward a degree in linguistics so that she could teach English to foreign students. She was 30 years old, 5 years older than he. What she didn't tell him at the time was that she was married to a Palestinian, Kamal. She'd married him because of the job in Kuwait. "You cannot be a single woman in Kuwait," she told him later. "If you are considered a whore." So it had been a marriage of convenience to make her life in Kuwait tolerable. Kamal was a friend who'd done her a favor. Kamal's father, a general in the Jordanian army, had been killed in the Six-Day War with Israel. He'd been considered a hero. Because of this, King Hussein regularly sent money to Kamal, who was trying to become an entrepreneur. He was growing hydroponic lettuce in Florida, and was involved in oil deals with Saudi Arabia. It seemed everyone hated the Saudis, but he could work out arrangements between Saudis and other Arabs as a middleman, because people were sympathetic to the Palestinians. The minute she'd left Yemen, Kamal had wanted her back, and she'd said, "Okay, you put me through school and we'll apply for a green card together. Then maybe we can have a reconciliation." Kamal had a brother in Missouri who was already a U.S. citizen, and if you had a relative here who had been granted citizenship, it improved your chances for the green card, which was like landed immigration status. It would allow her to work legally here and to do everything but vote. So that was her tie to Kamal. But all that came out later. After they left the cafe, they returned to the living room in the house. In this room, there was a very large mirror. He was standing next to it when she came up to him and started kissing him. It had never occurred to him that she might feel any romantic interest in him, and he was stunned. Then she said, "Let's go upstairs." Across from her door was the door of Zanib, her friend, the very orthodox Muslim Berber woman, and he felt uncomfortable standing there in the hall. Naeem's bedroom was gorgeous. There were embroidered Persian-style pillows on the floor, and exotic Yemeni jewelry on the walls, which had been made, he learned later, by Yemeni Jews, because Islamic law forbade Muslims from working in silver. She got undressed and slipped under the covers on her mattress on the floor. He shyly took off his clothes and climbed in with her. And while they made love, she whispered, "You mad Russian." He got up early the next morning and left. Coming out through her door, he was again afraid Zanib would see him. That evening, while he was having dinner, Naeem came to his room after her classes and began kissing him, and he had the feeling she wanted to make love to him again. They began to see each other, but they were discreet about it. Outside their rooms, they acted like friends. They didn't want to hurt Ali's feelings. She was trying to end that relationship gracefully. One of the things he first noticed, walking with her in the streets, was that she was perceived as a black woman. He could feel the stares from people, and she hated it, because she was proud of being a Yemeni. 3 weeks later, she asked if he'd like to go with her in August to the Edinburgh Festival, the largest theater festival in Europe. Her sister, Fadol, a famous Middle East dancer in Europe, would be performing there. He thought about it for 3 days, then gave notice to his boss and told her, "Yes, I'll go with you." She didn't want anyone to know about it because she was still trying to slowly cut things off with Ali. He felt as if he were bewitched, as if a spell had been cast over him. When he told his parents about Naeem and their trip, he described it in a very casual, offhand manner. It was just a fling, and why not? But they weren't happy about it. "Don't get involved with an Arab," they said. As it turned out, he left ahead of Naeem. He flew British Airways. Then he took the train to Oxford, where Fadol was to meet him at the station, thinking, "What am I doing? I'm about to meet an Arab woman dancer who might be involved with a terrorist ring. It's possible I'm being set up as some kind of sacrificial lamb." Fadol met him at the station. She was a few years younger than Naeem, and was also dark and beautiful. But she talked with a British accent, which he found disconcerting because Naeem spoke with an American accent she'd picked up in Missouri. It was peculiar to think of them as sisters. When they got to Fadol's house, he was surprised to see Ali, who was on his way back to visit his parents in Algeria. He was apparently also a friend of Fadol. No one had told Ali he was coming, so Ali knew immediately what was going on. That evening, Fadol, Ali, and he went out drinking. Ali was very moody. Then he stood up in the middle of their conversation, said, "I'm going to take a walk," and left. He didn't show up until 5 in the morning. Fadol couldn't figure out why. He didn't feel it was appropriate for him to tell her, but he felt overtaken by events and wondered, what am I getting involved in? I'm beginning to affect these people's lives. And it made him feel irresponsible. The next morning he walked Ali to the train station. He tried to make light conversation. "Well, what is it like going back home?" he asked. Ali turned to him. "What can you know about going back to a dirt village with parents who can't begin to comprehend what you have learned, or why you won't return?" And Ali said that Naeem had the same problem he did, because she couldn't reconcile the comforts she enjoyed in the United States with the problems and political turmoil that her family and people faced in her country, which seemed to imply that Ali was somehow better for her than he was, because he knew nothing. And Ali continued to talk about how he'd acquired education, and that this education had deeply corrupted him. Ali said he realized how westernized he'd become, and he hated it. He liked good wines, good restaurants, attended ambassadorial functions, liked the food and the heady intellectual conversations, and at the same time, he despised himself for it. But in the West, if you wanted to see a film, you could go right around the corner. There was a multitude of museums and concert halls and theaters, while back at home, there was nothing. Only government-produced films were shown in Algeria. But then he added proudly, they make excellent films there, and listed the great films made in his country. But the accessibility of culture was limited. Still, he said, that's all you Americans do. Consume everything, even culture. In many ways, my parents seem much better off than I. They're happier. They don't experience the conflicts I've acquired now that I've gone to school in the West. They see life in simple terms. Marry a local woman, settle down and help the village. But while he extolled the Algerian government as one of the most progressive in North Africa, he said it was overburdened with bureaucracy and was so corrupt no one could get anything done. In any case, he'd probably return to America in the fall to get his Ph.D. at Harvard. Now he knew that Ali, in his frustration, was also venting anger against him. Of all the things that Naim could have done to Ali, the most humiliating and insulting was to leave him for a Jew. When Naim arrived, they took 2 rooms in the Edinburgh University dorm and attended music, dance, and theatrical events. Sometimes he went alone while Naim helped her sister Fadol with her props and lighting in the rehearsal hall. Then came the night of the recital. It went on for 2 hours, and he found it painfully boring. But he told Naim that he had found it fascinating and wonderful. At night she would come to his room, and they'd make love. After Fadol's performance, in addition to attending more events, he followed Naim around Edinburgh as she went shopping. She loved clothes. He didn't much care what he wore. And she was a finicky eater. She'd spend hours roaming the streets, shopping, and looking for restaurants she felt would serve good food. Sometimes she seemed to him very spoiled. Once, in exasperation, as they looked for a place to eat, he said, "You know, you just can't rough it." And she became very upset. It was the worst thing he could have said to her, and she angrily defended herself. "I was the first Yemeni girl to ride a bicycle, the first one to leave the country and attend school in the States, which I paid for myself by working. I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to dress well. That doesn't mean I'm materialistic. The fact you care so little about yourself that you dress poorly is not my problem. It's yours." They began to go to movies together, to American films, and she was revolted by the violence. People were beaten, stabbed, shot. You'd see them lying in pools of blood, carted away under sheets or in body bags, and it totally repulsed her. She said Americans were sick because they liked sitting in a dark room watching people die. She reacted like someone who'd never experienced violence before. "You're conditioned to see it all the time," she said, "and that's why you're numb to it." He began to believe her. He felt sick about himself, as if he'd been corrupted. Then they went to see Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was a hit in America. Somewhere early in the film, a character is supposed to be walking the streets of Cairo, but Naim saw right away that they weren't. She said out loud, "That's not Egypt, that's Tunisia. The Tunisians have sold out the Arab League." And she added, "How can they let Hollywood producers make films that denigrate the Arabs?" He whispered, "Naim, please, be quiet." But she wouldn't be. "The Arabs in this film are acting like idiots," she cried. "That's the way they always portray us." Then, toward the end of the movie, she blew up. "This is Zionist propaganda. It's obviously showing that Israel has a right to exist because of the Ark." And the people sitting around them in the theater asked her to please keep her voice down. And finally, before the movie was over, they left. Then, in the car, they got into a violent argument. She wanted to know who directed the film. He said, "I'm not telling you." Then she started screaming at the top of her lungs, "Who directed that film? I want to know!" He knew it was Steven Spielberg, who was Jewish, and he repeated, "It doesn't matter. What difference does it make?" She got so upset she veered into the lane of oncoming traffic and almost killed him. He said, "I'm getting out because you're crazy. I'm not going to be maimed over Raiders of the Lost Ark." So he walked home. One of the first books she gave him was called Men in the Sun, written by a Palestinian. Ali had loaned it to her about a year ago, and she cherished it. It was the story of 3 Palestinians, men without a country, who'd been smuggled into Jerusalem from a refugee camp in order to find work, but had failed to make a living and were now attempting to leave Jerusalem for Kuwait. But in order to do this, they had to be smuggled illegally across the desert. When their truck approached the Kuwaiti border, they climbed into the empty water tank in the back to hide. But the truck was held up at the checkpoint for so long by Kuwaiti border guards that the Palestinians, suffering from dehydration and heat, rather than bang on the walls of the tank, quietly fried to death. The purpose of the story was to show the despair and the homeless condition of the Palestinians and urge them never to passively accept their fate, as the men in the water tanker had. It meant a lot to Naeem. She felt passionately about the Palestinian cause. And now he found himself going to parties where he was meeting Palestinians, Algerians, Libyans, and Saudis, who turned out to be individual human beings and didn't conform to the abstract notion he'd had of Arabs as wild-eyed fanatical terrorists without a trace of human feeling. At these parties, he was the only Jew. The others there assumed he was Lebanese. And Naeem was very popular. She had come from a family of 8 children and enjoyed being with people. He, on the other hand, had been an only child and didn't mind, even preferred being alone. They sometimes discussed this contrast between them. But their biggest difference, that she was an Arab and he was a Jew, seemed to fuel their relationship. It was the glue, ironically, that held them together. Then, one evening, they went to a fundraising party, a bake sale it turned out for Palestinian terrorists, in a home in Mount Pleasant. Many of the people there were wanted by the Israeli police. They'd committed terrorist acts and had gotten into the country to escape arrest. It was a militant crowd. The money they raised would help them to live an underground life in the States. He overheard one of them talking about the Israeli Secret Service. The young man said, "Yossi contacted me today." "You mean he knows you're here?" another asked. "Sure," he said. "They promised to put me through school at Georgetown if I don't come back to the West Bank." Apparently it was a common technique of Mossad. They tried to bribe terrorists who got away and came to this country into studying here, and eventually getting a green card so they wouldn't return to the West Bank. "It's just easier for Mossad to do that," the young Arab said. "Yossi's been bothering me for days. He says, 'What do you want to study? Do you want to become a doctor and make your parents proud?'" The young Palestinian was obviously contemptuous of the Mossad agent. Another young man spoke casually of a bomb he'd planted in a bus station, in which 3 women had been injured. Then the conversation turned to the relationship between America and Israel. They were all bitter because Israel was about to receive millions of dollars again, and why did America support such a state? Without its money and military aid, Israel wouldn't have a chance. And there was talk about Israeli raids on libraries and museums to confiscate Palestinian historical materials, to erase the notion there was a Palestinian history in the country. Then, at the end of the party, they asked Naeem to dance, and she did, and then she encouraged everyone to join her.